I'm Jessica, the Museum Guide, and today we're talking all about the history of death masks in museums around London, the UK, and the world, as well as how death masks connect to phrenology, the reading of all the bumps and shapes on your skull. Today we're exploring the fascinating and at times pseudoscientific history of death masks, funerary masks, wax effigies, and phrenology. These objects take us on a journey of art, anthropology, archaeology, and so much more. If you're returning to my channel, welcome back. And if you're new to my channel, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. If you're interested in watching more content, I do have a Patreon channel that I'll link just above. For the spooky month of October, I treated my patrons to a 30-minute tour of the spookiest objects in the British Museum. Click the link to have a look, and you can also buy that one as a one-off. Now, humans have been creating death masks and funerary masks for millennia. In some cases, in the belief that the mask could help notable kings and pharaohs reach the afterlife, and in some cases, so that people could pay their respects long after a person had died. The mask remains while the body decays. They have been used for funeral processions, tomb effigies, and as artist reference tools before the invention of photography, so that accurate portraits could be made long after a person's death. They've been sources of entertainment, criminal deterrence, and the basis of pseudoscience. So on our tour today, we're going to see dozens of death masks and talk about them in all of these different contexts. In addition to focusing on the newly reopened Death Mask Gallery at the National Portrait Gallery, we're visiting cemeteries, art galleries, and museums, and even popping into Westminster Abbey, St. Paul's Cathedral, and Madame Tussaud's Wax Museum. While death masks are certainly a spooky topic ideal for Halloween, they lead us to some even scarier places. Phrenology, and deeply unscientific ideas about race and class. Now, this is the perfect place to start our tour today. I'm in the Death Mask Room, room 32 at the National Portrait Gallery. Here we have a number of famous and infamous death masks and life masks of notables, such as Oliver Cromwell, of course, we'll see him a lot, Dante, Gabriel, Rosetti, William Blake, Tracey, Emin, and many more. I'll come back to these individuals and show you each one in this room toward the end of our tour today, but let's focus on this truly blood-curdling piece of art made out of human blood and kept chilled in this tank. It's very unusual compared to most of what we'll talk about today, but let's have a cheeky look at it before we dive into the history of our topic. This is Self by Marc Quinn, created in 2006. This is one in an ongoing series of self-portrait casts of the artist's head that he makes from his own blood and then freezes. Quinn originally emerged out of the young British artist movement in the 90s, just like Tracey Emin and Gillian, who we'll have a look at a bit later on. The National Portrait Gallery successfully led a fundraising drive to acquire this unique death mask, or is it a life mask? Is the blood dead or alive? One could argue that this, though cast from a live man's face, is the deadest mask that we'll encounter today, as it's made out of a material that would decay and rot if not kept frozen. Quinn made his first blood head in 1991. Since then, he's made a new iteration every 5 years, and each one contains a whopping 10 pints of blood. As you would expect from something so, organic. The technical curation of this sculpture presents the museum with unique challenges. It has to be kept frozen. Look at the icy frost upon his face. I mean, this is my favorite detail. But this case makes the entire room quite cold, which is fitting for the topic. After all, death masks are, at their core, about the dead, just as much as they are about the living. Let's head back in time and talk about the origin of death masks. Now, the first things we can consider as death masks date back many thousands of years. For instance, we can go back 9,000 years ago to look at the Jericho head held here at the British Museum. This is a real human skull covered in plaster and was an early attempt to immortalize a person's likeness forever. This is a very literal form of a death mask. It includes the dead person's head, which, in a strange way, I guess, so too does Marc Quinn's blood mask. Funerary masks come next on the timeline. These are masks that depict an idealized version of the deceased, some of them made from death masks and others not, but placed back on their face before burial rites, and usually also buried with them. They memorialize the features of the deceased, but they could also be used to force the spirit of the dead to depart for the spirit world, or to protect them from malevolent spirit. The beaten gold mask of Agamemnon is one of the most famous funerary masks out there, discovered in 1876 at the Bronze Age site of Mycenae in southern Greece, and originally thought to be that of Mycenaean King Agamemnon, leader of the Achaeans in the ancient Greek epic of the Trojan War, the Iliad, and he died in 1183 BCE. However, modern archaeological research suggests that the mask actually dates to about the 16th century BCE, predating the period of the mythical Trojan War by 300 or 400 years. Regardless, it keeps its name, erroneous or not. This is a replica of that famous mask here at the Science Museum. In their medical collection, they have 2 separate display cases of death masks. This one here can be found amongst the ephemera collected by Henry Wellcome, a fascinating display that I can spend hours exploring. I love it here. While we're here, let's zoom in on a few of these death masks, which are here in a case surrounded by other masks with deeply spiritual meanings from around the world. Here is a plaster death mask of Professor Max Neuberger, an Austrian physician and medical historian who worked at the Wellcome collection here in London. And here's Joseph Jackson Lister, who died in 1827. He was the father of hygiene pioneer Joseph Lister. This one's really neat, and it actually took me emailing the Science Museum directly to figure out who it was. I couldn't find anything online or on reverse Google image search, and that's because it's actually a life mask, which was made by the artist Lisa Temple Cox of the museum's then Keeper of Medicine, that is, the medical curator Natasha McEnroe. And this one here is not a death mask, but I can't resist including it. It's an optometrist's phantom for practicing eye procedures. It's probably the creepiest thing we'll see today. We'll visit the other display case of death masks here at the Science Museum a little bit later on when we talk about phrenology. Back to funerary masks, and one you're likely very familiar with. This one, that of King Tutankhamun, or King Tut. Tut died in 1325 BCE, and his tomb was discovered by Howard Carter and his Egyptian team in 1922. Though it was filled with unimaginable treasures, this elaborate funerary mask is one of the world's most recognizable pieces of art, and it's often used as synecdoche for Egyptology as a whole. But while it was likely based loosely on an idealized version of the young Tut's appearance, it's also meant to represent Osiris, god of the underworld. But it wasn't just pharaohs who were given the honor of a death mask. Egyptians often used death masks to help a person's soul recognize their body and return back to it so that Anubis could lead them to the realm of the dead. In texts of the New Kingdom, a period spanning 1550 BCE to 1070 BCE, a mask placed over the head of a mummy was called a suket, which meant egg, and sometimes a tep en seshta, meaning a head of secrets or a head of mysteries. Love that. Now, we know that the Egyptians were casting death masks to create funerary masks as early as 2300 BCE. This one here is a modern plaster cast taken from an ancient mold that was discovered at the Pyramid Temple of Teti at Saqqara in Egypt, dating to 2300 BCE. This may be King Teti himself, the first king of the 6th dynasty of Egypt, or it could be one of his wives. Cambodian and Thai kings were also buried with gold masks, as were the mummies of Inca royalty in ancient Peru. And there, regular people were also often buried with masks that were made of wood or clay. Now, the Romans took it one step further. Of course they did. They would hire actors to wear death masks resembling the deceased and then accompany the funerary cortege to the burial site. So extra, so Roman. Death masks at a funeral procession? Well, keep that in mind for a little bit later on when we talk about the royal effigies at Westminster Abbey. It's very similar kind of tradition. Now let's enter into the early Renaissance period of the 15th and 16th centuries. And what had started as masks made with a spiritual purpose became a much more practical endeavor. They were a way to preserve the memory of the dead and create templates for the prolific Renaissance artists to create sculptures and artwork. Renaissance artists strove to make increasingly realistic work, and death masks helped them to capture the appearance of notables and royals so that they could create their true image before they rotted away. And remember, this is something we come to again and again on this tour, the idea of trying to preserve or make concrete the ephemeral, fleeting nature of the flesh. Now, increasingly, death masks were created for royalty to create ever more lifelike tomb effigies, like this one here of Elizabeth I in Westminster Abbey, which dates to 1603. This effigy is quite famous, because Elizabeth is obviously famous, but she was known as a vain woman who didn't like to be seen without a lot of heavy makeup. I hear you, girl. Even in her portraits in her older age, she's often depicted as much younger and with a smooth, flawless complexion. That's why this effigy sparks so much interest. It was cast from her actual death mask, and she really does look her age. Speaking of queens in Westminster Abbey, there were also 4 wax death masks made of Mary Queen of Scots, immediately after her brutal beheading, which took 3 passes of the executioner's axe. From these, some very detailed and painted versions have been made. I mean, have a look. She looks very pretty and peaceful here, despite that terrible end. And she too has a gorgeous tomb effigy in the Lady Chapel, courtesy of her son, James I. But these are not the oldest tomb effigies based on a death mask here in the Abbey. That honor goes to Edward III, who died in 1377. While there are older tomb effigies, like this one here of Henry III, who died in 1272, they don't seem to have been based on actual death masks. See, we know that Edward III's was because we have a strange version of the mask, and it's upstairs in the Queen's Jubilee Gallery. So let's go have a look. Now, these are not tomb effigies, that is, the permanent sculptures that go on top of a final resting place, but these are instead the funeral effigies of 21 different monarchs and nobles, dating from the 14th century to the early 17th century. Some are made of wood and some of wax. Some even have plaster aspects, but they tell a fascinating story. These temporary sculptures would be used in the funeral procession, placed on top of the coffin and then topped with a canopy. We aren't really familiar with these anymore because they're no longer common. The practice died out, pun intended, in the 18th century, and I talk more about this in my video on the oddities of Westminster Abbey. Now, many of these effigies, including that of Henry VII here, were modeled on their death masks. His death mask was also used by Florentine sculptor Pietro Torrigiani to create this painted terracotta bust that is on display here at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Though it was cast from a death mask, Torrigiani has shown him here very much alive. Now, Westminster Abbey isn't the only church to hold death masks and effigies. St. Paul's Cathedral also has an interesting death mask, that of its architect, Sir Christopher Wren. Since this church was his true crowning achievement, it's no wonder that his grave and his death mask are here. On the tour today, we are visiting a lot of museums, but we're also heading to Madame Tussaud's. Now, is this truly a museum? I think it is, in a way. We're not going to spend too much time with the iconic Madame today. I'll give her her own video in the future. But I want to draw your attention to her connection and contribution to the art of the death mask, especially as they began to gain popularity amongst the masses in the 18th and 19th centuries. Born Marie Grosholz in 1761, Madame Tussaud's family were public executioners, and she later worked for her housekeeper mother's employer, the famous anatomist Philippe Curtius, who specialized in moulage, or wax models of the human body, like these here at the Science Museum, and of course, those here at Le Musée des Moulages in Paris. Working as his apprentice, she learned the art of making death masks of guillotined heads during the French Revolution. One of her most, let's face it, badass acts was slipping past the police and creating the death mask of radical Jean-Paul Marat after he was murdered by Charlotte Corday in his bathtub. She later wrote in her memoirs that during guillotine executions she was, quote, on the steps of the exhibitions with the bloody heads on her knees, taking the impressions of their features. In 1802, she packed up a duffel bag of disembodied aristocratic wax heads, headed to London, and opened her own traveling show around England. Waxworks were a popular form of entertainment in the 18th century, and creating them was a profession that was surprisingly dominated by women, including London's famous Mrs. Salmon and Patience Wright in Philadelphia. Eventually, when she was 74, she set up a permanent location here in London's fashionable Baker Street. This was the middle of the 1830s, but this place still greets visitors to this day. Her most popular exhibits then are still the most popular today: royalty and horror. She continued to have life and death masks made of the most infamous criminals of the day, including body snatchers William Burke and William Hare. Marie herself cast Burke's head just 3 hours after his execution in 1829, and Hare, who turned king's evidence and escaped punishment, was later modeled from life by Tussaud's son. She lived until the grand old age of 88 in 1850. Her waxworks helped to popularize death masks from all over Europe and the world, and here in the UK, at the height of the Victorian Gothic period, people believed that the sooner the death mask was taken, the more of a person you could capture. In some cases, they would even call for the death mask maker before they signed the death certificate. Now we're still here in the 19th century, and let's carry on this tangent of the death mask and criminality. Let's just pause here and have a look at this photo of death masks from the George Marshall Medical Museum in Worcester. These masks share one thing in common: they belong to criminals. Sadly, I didn't make it to Worcester in time for this video, and London's Black Museum isn't open to the public, despite my pleas. But I did want to bring up the connection between criminality, death masks, and phrenology. See, these masks belonged to hanged Worcestershire prisoners of the early 19th century. After they were hanged in the jail, their corpses were brought to the Royal Infirmary to be autopsied and studied, as the medical professionals searched for anatomical clues that could reveal the cause of their depravity and criminality. Sadly, the records behind these death masks, and many of those here on display at the Science Museum, have been lost. We don't even know their names, let alone the details of their post-mortem examinations. However, we do know that all kinds of wild conclusions were drawn from the shapes of these men's heads, and who was more likely to commit crimes. To understand this link a bit more, I'm now back at that other display case I told you I would visit. Now this one here tells the story of the sinister pseudoscience that developed in the 18th and 19th centuries. Here we can see this phrenology skull that you are encouraged to touch while you listen to a short recording about the history of this topic. You can also see this traveling case of teensy phrenology heads designed for a doctor or other practitioner to take with them on their travels, allowing them to identify and diagnose many different head shapes. Harmless, right? No. Sometimes even in my comment section, I get people espousing long debunked theories about brain size, head shape, and race that all date back to this time period. Because that's where Dr. Franz Joseph Gall comes into play. He was a German neuroanatomist, physiologist, and one of the first doctors to believe that he could gain insight into a person's character and abilities by examining their head shape with a specially designed tool, the calipers. Of course, this can all get out of hand very quickly. After doctors like Gall decided that there was a relationship between the function of the brain and the shape of the skull, people started using it for all kinds of morally questionable reasons, measuring the heads and faces of criminals, the poor, and different races of people, looking for that secret that led to high intelligence. Anytime I see somebody pull out some calipers, I know we're in for a lot of BS. Dr. Gall developed his twin theories of organology and cranioscopy that would later be known as phrenology. He believed that the mind was many different independent entities housed within the brain, and that these all exerted different amounts of pressure on the skull bones. Cranioscopy, then, was a way to measure the lumps and bumps caused over time by this pressure. Based on what he believed were 27 different areas on the surface of a person's skull, Gall believed that he could judge a person's fundamental skills and aptitudes, and therefore their character. For instance, those of a mirthful disposition, that is, those who like to laugh, would have 2 prominent bumps on the forehead when compared to their less cheerful contemporaries. Did you just feel your forehead? However, this was a slippery slope, as certain head shapes were also correlated to negative attributes. As this display illustrates, phrenology quickly evolved from curiosity about links between criminality and head shape to a truly sinister pseudoscience that was applied to race and class. While some aspects of Dr. Gall's work did lead to important theories and discoveries in psychology and sociology, his theories of bump reading were abandoned and are today known to be junk science, simply because the results could not be replicated. His findings were too bound up in his own hang-ups about race and class. Before we leave, let's just have a look at some of these death masks and life masks. Most of these, as I mentioned, are unidentified criminals. But this one here is actually thought to be a life mask of Franz Gall himself, cast by a fellow phrenologist, James Deville, who had one of the largest collections of phrenology skulls in London that he actually opened as a museum for a time. We'll see some of his work again a little bit later on. In the case, you can see that a lot of these heads aren't just death masks. They're casts of the entire head, and of course, that's because they were used for phrenology. For instance, this one here was cast of William Dodd, who originally made his career as a preacher and writer, but he began to live beyond his means, and to pay off his debts, he forged over £40,000 in 1777. He was quickly arrested and confessed to his crime, which carried the death sentence. While 23,000 people campaigned to save him from what they thought was too harsh a punishment, he was eventually hanged, and this cast was taken of his head to determine whether there was something physical about his criminal behavior. So now we have talked about the connection between death masks and the pseudoscience of phrenology. But one death mask has a connection to the very real science of emergency medicine. I'm here at the Museum of the Order of St. John in Farringdon. This is the monastic order that would eventually become the modern first aid organization, St. John's Ambulance. In their permanent collection, they hold this porcelain model reproduced from a very famous death mask, repeatedly cast from the face of an unknown woman who drowned in the river Seine in Paris in the late 19th century. Though she'd been in the water for some time, her face was peaceful, serene, and beautiful. An attendant at the morgue was apparently so moved by her beauty and youth that he ordered a plaster mold of her face, and it was reproduced for private collection, and it became a fashionable curio to own in one's cabinet of curiosities. In 1958, Norwegian toymaker Edmund Layerdal was commissioned to design a mannequin that would help train people in a brand new technique, that of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, or CPR. He remembered that his grandparents had had a model of the unknown drowned woman in their home, and he decided to use this face as his prototype. She would become known as Resusci Anne. To this day, Resusci Anne is used in St. John Ambulance first aid training courses, and she was even referenced in Michael Jackson's song, Smooth Criminal. After all, when you take that course, you are taught to ask, Annie, are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay, Annie? Now let's head out of the museum and into the cemetery, shall we? We're on the west side of London's majestic Highgate Cemetery, and we're in the height of the Victorian era. The Victorians were known for their elaborate mourning rituals and customs, and death masks helped to fulfill this obsession and aid in their grieving process. Victorians may have been buttoned up and repressed, but man, did they love grieving rituals. In the 19th century, some of the world's most important figures were choosing to have death masks cast of their face, or their families chose for them. People like Beethoven, Abraham Lincoln, and Napoleon had death masks made. Napoleon actually had 4, and here I am with a copy of one of those that's held at the British Museum. It seems like every European museum has got a copy of Napoleon's death mask, but back to Highgate Cemetery. Now here, this is a deeply painful death mask to talk about. This is in the mausoleum of Ada Beer, who died aged 8 in 1875 in an epidemic of scarlet fever. She is depicted in the arms of an angel who was modeled on her mother, and Ada's face was based off of her death mask. Death masks, though not common on Victorian tombstones, do appear now and then, but there is a contemporary artist who is bringing them back into fashion at Highgate and beyond. Nick Reynolds of the band Alabama 3 takes it one step further. See, he had an eccentric and unusual childhood. He's the son of the infamous Bruce Reynolds, the mastermind behind 1963's Great Train Robbery. Nick Reynolds is the last artist here in the UK still making death masks, and he really makes them into an art form. After completing his father's death mask for his iconic grave on the east side of Highgate Cemetery, he has since been commissioned to make many others, including 2 more that are here at the cemetery. Here we can see punk rock impresario Malcolm McLaren, and here is Iranian surgeon and political campaigner Dr. Manucher Sabetian. This one is the newest, completed in 2019, just a few days after his death. Now, while these are on very public display, Reynolds also takes on about 4 or 5 private commissions per year for casts of face and hands from families who are grieving the loss of loved ones. He says, quote, "A death mask can create a focal point to talk to somebody, whether you believe in an afterlife or not," and he admits to talking to his own copy of his father's death mask. As for their unique allure, he says the mystery of death seems to slip into the casting, and that's what gives them their otherworldly feel. I was lucky enough to hear him give a fantastic talk in 2018, back when I used to volunteer at Bart's Pathology Museum. He charges around £2,500 for his craft and counts British Conservative politician and Victorian ghoul Jacob Rees-Mogg as a past client. He had his father's face cast. Now, while Reynolds specializes in death masks, he also creates many life masks, which, as the name suggests, are cast when the person is alive. Now, of course, this is actually a lot more challenging than creating a death mask because you have to worry about pesky things like, breathing, claustrophobia, and pain. We'll see that a bit later on. The National Portrait Gallery actually shows a short documentary in Room 32 featuring Reynolds and his process. I'll pop the link down in the description. In the video, he describes the process of creating a life mask, or a death mask. It's very similar. He first covers the face in blue alginate, which is what dentists use to take impressions of teeth, and then he creates a hard casing around it with plaster bandages, which he fills with wax or plaster. Afterwards, the plaster or wax face is molded and painted in silicone, and that mold is filled with polyurethane resin mixed with a metal powder. The metal, which is heavier, sinks to the surface of the cast, leaving a bronze face that can stand the test of time. Often, he doesn't get the call from clients until a few weeks after death, when the body has been kept cold or frozen and the family is preparing for the funeral and starting to really understand the finality of their loved one's loss. Of course, parts of the face can become shrunken or sunken during that 2-week time, and so Reynolds uses a bit of artistic license to sculpt their features and give them a more peaceful and true-to-life appearance. However, if the person has only recently died, the effect of having a death mask can almost be like a facelift. There's no tension in the face, and the lines and wrinkles are soft and smoothed out. The result is a peaceful image that can bring great comfort to the family. One such fresh corpse that Reynolds worked on belonged to John Joe Amador, a death row inmate in Texas that Reynolds believed was innocent. For this casting, Amador's body was still warm. Later, after making the initial death masks, Reynolds placed Amador's face on the back of an armadillo to create this work. The armadillo was the emblem of the state that executed him. It's an interesting callback to the history of the death mask and the executed criminal. I also just want to note that I learned so much about Nick Reynolds, not to mention got these great quotes, from the book All the Living and the Dead, From Embalmers to Executioners, an exploration of the people who've made death their life's work, by Haley Campbell. I think you'll love it. I've just linked it down below in my Amazon shop. And now that we've learned all about the history of death masks and visited tons of museums, cemeteries, and churches, let's head back to where we started, into the National Portrait Gallery, and have a better look around this impressive collection. I'm very excited because when I planned this video about death masks, I didn't actually know that the National Portrait Gallery had opened this gallery featuring the very subject. Remember, we already examined this blood mask. I mean, how could you forget? Some of the pieces in this room are life masks, some are part of art projects, and other are classic 18th and 19th century death masks. Let's start here with an old stalwart, the death mask of Oliver Cromwell. Seems like every museum in England has a Cromwell death mask. There's one here. Here I am visiting this one at the Sir John Soane Museum, though Soane did think this was mutineer Richard Parker when he acquired it. By the way, the National Portrait Gallery has 3 more Cromwell death masks in its collection, though they're not on display. Now, the original wax of Cromwell, of which this is a plaster copy, was probably taken for his funeral effigy. He had quite an elaborate one, dressed in velvet and ermine, that lay in state at Somerset House for 11 weeks. Of course, his actual head is that of infamy. After he was disinterred in January 1661, and on the anniversary of the execution of Charles I, his corpse was strung up and beheaded at Tyburn. His head was then displayed on the top of a pole for over 20 years, so he looks a lot fresher here. Here is Dante Gabriel Rosetti. Kind of a neat synergy, because Dante Alighieri's death mask is so famous, and Rosetti went by his middle name Dante in honor of the great 14th century writer and philosopher. I talk a lot about Rosetti and the pre-Raphaelites in my Highgate West video, which I've just linked above. Now, isn't this one wonderful and peaceful? This is Sir Thomas Lawrence, all tucked up in a bed with his head on a pillow. He was an English painter and the 4th president of the Royal Academy, and I think this one might be one of my favorites in terms of peacefulness and comfort it would have brought to his family. The Portrait Gallery has a lot more masks in the collection that are not on display, including British Romantic painter John Constable, most known for his beloved Hay Wain, painter George Frederick Watts, who started the tradition of the memorials to heroic self-sacrifice in Postman's Park, and an iron cast of scientist Sir Isaac Newton. And this cast of politician and military man extraordinaire Arthur Wellesley, aka the Duke of Wellington. It was cast by George Gammon Adams 3 days after the Duke's death at Walmer Castle in Deal in 1852. But his false teeth had already been removed, and his face appears shriveled and unrecognizable. Of course, you may have already noticed that most death masks were cast of famous and important men. So it's nice to see a woman here and there. This is Ellen Terry. She was the leading British actress in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Here she is here. Isn't she lovely? Especially in this wonderful photo portrait by Julia Margaret Cameron, herself worthy of an entire video. When Ellen Terry died in 1928, Margaret Windsor, an accomplished sculptor, created this death mask. In the center of the room, we see one of the most celebrated British writers and artists, William Blake, who wrote The Tiger and Jerusalem, and also painted an entire series of works about Dante Alighieri. This is not a death mask, it's a life mask, cast by James Deville, the phrenologist I mentioned earlier. Remember, he cast Franz Gall's face, and this was taken 4 years before Blake's death. Blake has a pinched, unhappy look on his face, and that's because Deville was not actually very good at casting. Blake normally was a very gentle and cheerful man, but Deville wasn't always very good at doing this and had caught all of the little hairs on his face, so he was in a lot of pain. Back over on the wall, let me point out some of the others that are life masks. Here are romantic poets William Wordsworth and John Keats, who was only 22 here, such a baby face. Both were cast by painter Benjamin Robert Haydon, and interestingly, a mask of Haydon himself completes the trio by an unknown artist, or maybe he did it himself or with help? Over on one side, we can see one that I absolutely love, the novelist and counterculture icon Aldous Huxley, cast by Paul Hammond in 1981, but based on a cast taken in 1930. I think it is sort of a groovy feel, which is fitting as Huxley wrote The Doors of Perception while on mescaline. And here's one more that I really do love. A life mask cast by British pop artist Clive Barker. No, not that Clive Barker who wrote Hellraiser. A figurative artist, Francis Bacon. No, not that Francis Bacon, the philosopher. Francis Bacon, known for his surreal and unsettling portraits. This was created in 1969, 20 years before Bacon's death. Barker later went on to create 12 different bronze sculptures of Bacon's face. Finally, let's move on to some modern art that pushes the boundaries of the death mask and takes this strange ancient art form to new and different places. We already saw Nick Reynolds' piece that combines John Joe Amador's face with an armadillo, but how about this one? It isn't held here in London, but I can't resist bringing up this by sculptor Robert Gober, who cast the snout of his beloved dog Paco when he died unexpectedly, and then blended it with a cast of his own face, creating this frankly nightmarish kind of Dr. Moreau result in 2008. But back here to the portrait gallery. This is a sort of life mask that challenges the border between life masks and other types of sculpture. This is Susie Cooper, by Susie Cooper, that dates to 1933. She kind of looks like Betty Boop. Let's spend a few minutes having a look at these pieces by Gillian Waring. She has created these masks, or are they sculpture? What's the difference here? Where does art end and death mask casting begin? Now, this is civil rights campaigner Shami Chakrabarti. We have a new form of technology at play here. Waring digitally scanned Chakrabarti's face instead of casting it traditionally. Waring, who was one of the young British artists and won the Turner Award in 1997, works a lot with wax masks and casting her own face and hands, as she did here for this 2020 piece entitled Lockdown. Remember that? Whew, it's like a fever dream, literally for some people. And finally, let's have a look at another of the young British artists. They're really well represented in this room, and they're not so young anymore. This is one piece from the Death Mask series, created by Tracey Emin. Emin, who also won the Turner Prize in 1999 for her controversy-sparking work My Bed, is known for her confrontational yet honest autobiographical works. And what better way to tell the story of your life than with your own face? She cast 4 different impressions of her own face in 2002. Here is just one on display, made from bronze and gold, and carrying on in a long tradition of life and death masks, bringing them into the 21st century. I think it's only fitting that we end our tour today with another quote from Nick Reynolds. There's something about taking a mask of someone, whether you do believe the mystery of death passes off into it or not. I think, for a lot of people, they suddenly realize that the person's gone and they want a part of them to stay. Personally, I think they're great things, death masks. I think it's amazing that there's the person dead, and you can just click your fingers more or less, and they turn to stone, and you can keep that instead of it rotting on you. Well, that's the end of our tour. I hope you found all of this information about death masks as interesting as I do. I'd love more suggestions for tours you'd like to see in the comments below, and I'll see you the next time I'm at the museum.